What is the relationship between your creativity and your age? Do we hit our peak creativity when we're younger and then it gradually declines? Or are we like a fine wine that improves with age? Hi, it's James Taylor here. The media loves the idea of the young creative genius, the 20-year-old musician or artist who creates a whole new style, or a 30-year-old Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur who disrupts their industry. Yet, we also sometimes hear stories of those innovators who flower a little later in life. The writer who writes their first book in their 40s, which goes on to become an international bestseller, or a scientist perhaps, who makes a groundbreaking discovery in their 50s or their 60s. So what is going on? How and why does the quality of someone's creative work vary with their age? Economist and academic David W. Gellinson recently looked at when in their lives great artists produce their best work. At first it was difficult to see any real patterns. You see, some achieve overnight success early in their careers, while others strive for creative perfection over many decades of pain and frustration. But gradually, in examining the careers of the greatest painters, sculptors, novelists, and movie directors, he found there is a link between peak creativity and age. You see, there are two fundamentally different approaches to creativity and innovation as it relates to your age. But before we go into that, let's first define what we mean by someone being a creative genius or an innovator. Gellinson defines the greatest innovators as those whose work changes the practice of their peers or their successors. As a result of this, great art are those works which embody these innovations. Fundamentally, the importance of someone's creative work is the extent that it influences other creatives. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created Apple, and their products and their ethos went on to influence future generations of innovators. Now, let's explore the idea of there being two different approaches to creativity. Gellinson calls these the experimental innovators and the conceptual innovators. Experiential innovators work by trial and error, and their best work often happens later in their life. Meanwhile, conceptual innovators make sudden breakthroughs by formulating totally new ideas and ways of looking at the world, usually at an early age. If we think of different artists working in different creative cycles, then Michelangelo, Jackson Pollock, Alfred Hitchcock were experimental old masters, while Picasso, Raphael, and Orson Welles were conceptual young geniuses. Now, how can you discover whether you're an experimental or a conceptual creative? Experimental innovators rarely make detailed plans, preferring instead to let the creative work develop over lots of small iterations. It's common with these experimental creatives that they will continually return to past motifs or themes. They find the ideas and the aha moments during the process of working itself and not in the planning or in the preparation stage. One such experimenter was the artist Miro, who said, "Forms take reality for me as I work." In other words, rather than setting out to paint something, I begin painting, and as I paint, the picture begins to assert itself or suggest itself under my brush. In the world of business, an experimental innovator would be the marketer or the entrepreneur who's running lots of tests, building minimum viable products, and being agile in their approach. Classic lean startup methodology. Innovations in this world are won by hard-earned skill that take a lot of time. If we think of literature, then the classic experimental creatives would be Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and Virginia Woolf. While in movie making, they would be John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, for example. This contrasts very sharply with the conceptual innovator, who sees planning as the most important stage. They want to have a clear vision of the future project or the finished work, or know in detail the process that they're going to use to produce it. As a result, the execution or implementation is a little bit more systematic. The conceptual innovator is primarily motivated by the desire to communicate specific ideas or emotions. Once the idea is realized or that problem is solved, then they simply move on. So whereas an experimental innovator typically produces many innovations that are related to each other, the conceptual innovator can jump between very distinct fields of study, mediums, or even themes. To an outsider, it may be impossible to find that red thread in their work or a recurring motif because they're always moving onto that next big thing. When it comes to the literature, the classic conceptual creatives would be F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, or James Joyce. While in movie making, they would be a Federico Fellini or an Orson Welles. Once we begin to think of ourselves as either an experimental creative or a conceptual creative, we can use this to produce more innovative work. If you're an experimenter, then don't overthink it. Dive in, get your hands dirty, experiment, test, treat your work like a journey of discovery. Your best work is yet to come. Meanwhile, if you're a conceptual innovator, then your genius lies in your ability to plan in detail, to create a picture in your mind for what you want to create, and then to execute systematically and at speed. Be ambitious for your creative work. Experimental innovators seek new ideas. Conceptual innovators find new ideas. My name is James Taylor, and thanks for watching.